So let's just talk about the book. What is it about? Who are the characters? Just for a quick overview for people who are unfamiliar with it.
Sure. It's about three and a half brothers. The half is a stepbrother, who was fathered by the brother's own father, but with a different mother. And the three brothers plot against their father. He's a drunkard and a voluptuary, and they finally decide that they're going to do him in. And all three of them are in some way culpable for wishing him dead. And I don't want to give it away, but he is murdered during the course of the novel. You find that out right away. The beginning, it starts by saying the terrible events that happened in our little town several years ago, namely the murder of Fyodor Karamazov. And that triggers the novel, which is an investigation of the background to his murder, and shows how each one of the three brothers is in some way culpable of the parricide. And it ends with a trial of one of the brothers, and he's well, I won't say anymore.
Okay.
It's a good all Dostoevsky's novels are murder mysteries, and this one is a murder mystery in the sense that you know who it has been murdered, but you don't know who did it or why he did it.
And of course, the most famous scene is the Grand Inquisitor part. That seems to be, even if you haven't read the book, you're at least familiar with that tale, or if you've heard about it in a Western Civ class, maybe. I think that was my first introduction to the book, was in Western Civ. My professor mentioned his car broke down in some flyover state, maybe Iowa, and he had to spend a few days in a motel, and he found a copy of the book in a local gas station. And he said, if it wasn't for that book, I don't know if I would have stayed sane during that. But he mentioned the Grand Inquisitor part, and can you give a brief overview of what that is?
Well, it's often excerpted, which is unfair to Dostoevsky because he spends a good part of the following chapters refuting the arguments of the Grand Inquisitor. The Grand Inquisitor makes the case that Christ left men with freedom, and that was a terrible burden, and that they, the Grand Inquisitor and fellow churchmen, have taken away man's freedom and instead given him happiness. And happiness for the average mortal man, says the Inquisitor, is preferable to freedom. Christ has come back on earth and is listening to the Grand Inquisitor's arguments and makes no rebuttal. I won't say what he does instead, but it's a one-sided argument in the actual chapter of the Grand Inquisitor. After that's done, Dostoevsky goes into great length to describe the Russian monk, in particular Father Zosima, who gives sermons and whose life is one of virtue and is a counterpoint to the Grand Inquisitor. So it's a novel about faith and disbelief, what it is to believe in something, and man's quest for something to believe in. So the cover shows a monk on his way to a church or a monastery, and it's representing the quest that the reader and the author are engaged in as they search for truth.
Yeah, I think it was the quest aspect of the book that made it, in my opinion, the best book I've ever read. Particularly the few chapters kind of in the middle, where Alyosha's kind of recording Father Zosima's life. That's what kind of stood out to me in the book.
Mm-hmm.
But do you think that the Grand Inquisitor scene was kind of prophetic of the direction Russia was going in?
Well, I don't know that it was prophetic. It certainly has been vindicated by recent events. Dostoevsky was very concerned that his portrayal of the Russian monk, both his life and his sermons, which Alyosha records in the book, would counterbalance the argument of the Grand Inquisitor. He was afraid that the Grand Inquisitor's case would be so powerful that men would be swept, or readers would be swept away by it and begin to doubt their beliefs. Whether they did or they didn't is a matter open for discussion. But Dostoevsky's letters are full of his doubts that he was successful in posing the counter to the Grand Inquisitor's arguments.
I feel like he did, but to me, the chapter that stood out the most was actually the one that immediately precedes the Grand Inquisitor one, when Ivan is just, he basically says it, and tell me if this is a good enough summary of Ivan's argument in that chapter. Was that if God requires the suffering of innocent children to reveal his truths, then the price is too high, and he rejects that. And I think that that's the most common argument I hear from atheists for why they just don't believe in it. And I feel like Dostoevsky does a good job giving the devil his due in that chapter. And it's he takes that argument seriously. So it was a disturbing chapter to me as well, as I read it. To Dostoevsky's credit, you kind of know what his personal beliefs are reading the book, but he also, he really gives the devil's due, I thought, that chapter.
It's a very fair summary. There's also the devil's appearance in Ivan's nightmare, in which he belittles Ivan and his arguments and his Grand Inquisitor, and Dostoevsky gives the devil his own say, in a chapter called Ivan's Nightmare. So that's also an impressive piece.